Good afternoon. Maybe, yeah, thank you. So, welcome everyone. So, I understand everybody is seeing each other first time in this colloquium room after the new year. It's nice that everybody wants to talk to each other. That's what we want. And so, I hope everybody had some relaxing holidays and welcome to the new year, of course. So I'm very happy to introduce today Riccardo Saroli as our first colloquium speaker of 2024. Riccardo is an associate professor of cognitive science at Aarhus University at the renowned Interactive Mind Center, which I always admire the name. Apparently this name was already used by another center. So Riccardo, I think, has a very colorful and creative profile and working always on the fun side of things that everybody wants to work on, but maybe cannot. And he also has a very interdisciplinary profile. Today he had meetings from 9 o'clock till now, so it means that he can reach to a lot of different people and connect with them. So he has a strongly interdisciplinary and as well as also international background, combining semiotics and communication, which he did at the University of Bologna, of cognitive science, which he's doing at Aarhus University, and he was also at University of California, Merced. And he also works on complex systems approaches, which he did at the Santa Fe Institute. I think what makes Riccardo very unique is his approach to understanding interaction and conversational dynamics using qualitative and very strong statistical quantitative approaches, such as Bayesian statistics and machine learning, conducted with typical and atypical populations, as in autism and schizophrenia, in adults as well as children that we will hear today. Furthermore, in studying interaction, he also combines language, movement, and cognition in very unique ways. He has also looked into influence of interaction on language and cultural evolution, and even he has worked on co-laughter. As I said, he always works on the fun topics. He has also published this amazing work in top journals such as Autism Research, PNAS, Neuroimage, Psychological Science, Cognition, among others. And not the least, Riccardo is very well known for his open science approach and constantly making his analysis and codes available to other young researchers, and he's very passionate about teaching them, and we are hoping to get him here for a week to teach these wonderful methods to our students as well. And he has also kindly hosted some of our PhD students or other researchers from here at Aarhus University in the Interactive Mind Center. And so I'm really looking forward to now giving the floor to him and hearing his insights about the child and caregiver interactions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both for the invitation and the kind words and the great attendance. I'm very excited. As Asli was saying, I'll be talking about the development of turn-taking in child-caregiver interaction, and I want to make it front-loaded that a lot of the most amazing part of the work has been done by Chris Cox, who's one of my current PhD students waiting for his dissertation to be evaluated. So if you're one of the opponents, be very kind with him. He's great. A couple of words more on who I am. This is basically what my daily life looks like. My kids are a bit older now, but the dynamics are just the same. As Asli was saying, I was trained as a semiotician in Bologna. That meant that I spent a lot of years trying to delve deep into pragmatist philosophy and trying to develop ways in which to understand the way that our human expression makes sense, from movies to website to literature and to wine, which was pretty fun. And I got really intrigued by this philosophical perspective that a lot of what humans do and think and cognize, to use a terrible word, is actually something that we do together. It's collective meaning making. And now I identify as cognitive scientist, even if I've never studied cognitive science, and I even persuaded Aarhus University to give me a position in that. My everyday life in the office is mostly about lots of computational statistical methods applied to empirical and sometimes even experimental data, so a very different thing from what I was doing before. But I would argue that a lot is still permeating my approach. And I hope you see it throughout the next slides. But first is that I see a lot of cognition in a broad sense as a collective meaning making, as something that is imbued with cultural practices and interpersonal dynamics. And conversations is a key place where we can see how this unfolds. Second, that as I do scientific research from a more, what would in Italian at least would be say like more natural science or hard science perspective, I cannot help but looking at myself and at my colleagues and see scientific practices as, in a sense, just one case of cultural practices with blind spots, with traditions, with ways we do things. And by applying these gaze, I think that actually we can learn not only to use science as an object of science, but also to do things in a different way, become more aware of our blind spots. So, now to the flesh of the content. What are we going to talk about? I'm going to give you a very, very brief introduction to why turn taking is interesting. It's probably an easy sale here, but I'll still do that. I will then move into a systematic review and meta-analysis of what has been done in vocal turn-taking in child-caregiver interactions. Why vocal? Well, there were only 3 or 4 papers that we could find with other modalities, and the people on that paper not being expert in gestural and sign language and other modalities, we decided that we actually needed to leave it for further work, but it's super important. We will then apply the lessons learned during the evidence synthesis above to do better on a longitudinal study on turn-taking in 2 to 5-year-olds autistic and typically developing children. And since developing children of all kind of types are actually quite heterogeneous, we will then see whether the findings generalize to a slightly different sample of 10-year-old autistic and typically developing children who were tested and assessed over a 7-week period, 1 session per week. Finally, I will sketch where I think that the field should go, or at least where I'll bring my own portion of the field into an exploration of formalized mechanisms of how turn-taking is actually generated. And I'm going to argue that we can learn much by looking at how turn-taking is studied in non-human animals. If not just what they're doing, but also what it becomes obvious to us that they're not doing from our human-animal perspective. Okay, that I said. So, why are we even interested in turn-taking? I'm sure you've seen this short video, but I'll show you a few seconds of it to give you a feeling for it. Okay, if you haven't seen it before, it's really fun to watch it. It's actually much longer. But what's going on here is that we have 2 infants that, at least for the purpose of the video, they are actually pre-verbal. They're not using words. And nevertheless, they're engaging in a very nicely structured interaction, proto-conversation, where they alternate in when one is vocalizing or the other is vocalizing, and punctuating the interaction with moments of joint vocalizations like co-laughter. So they're doing this in a very skillful way. It's something that we can recognize even if they're not using language in the way we're expecting. So turn-taking is the structuring of a social interaction in a temporal fashion with these interplay of alternations and joint vocalizations. It can be argued to be very foundational to social interactions. We've seen it is here even before language per se. And it has been argued to be quite foundational, for instance, to transfer information in an effective way. If I was talking to you and you were talking at the same time, it would be harder at least to pay attention to what the other is saying and to respond in adequate ways to what we are saying to each other. But also in a series of clever experiments by Emma Templeton in a recent paper, it's also been shown to be strictly related to shared emotions and rapport, where tight turn-taking, that is jumping in and responding to me immediately after when I finish speaking, is correlated with higher quality, perceived quality of the interaction, both by the interlocutors and by third-party raters. This tightly timed turn-taking is ubiquitous across cultures. There's two studies that I guess generated from here, one by Stivers et al. In 2009, one by Dingemanse et al. In 2023, that show that across a wide variety of languages, cultures, and language families, the time that it takes to respond to your interlocutor turns is pretty fast, 250 milliseconds in question answers snippets that Stivers et al. Analyzed, 56 milliseconds in a more broad range set of turns, successive turns that Dingemanse et al. Analyzed. And there is some linguistic variation, but still we are in this domain of very fast response latencies that in traditional experiments, right, we would basically throw away. I don't know about you, but when I do my experiments, we expect that people will take 200, 300 milliseconds to process and respond to a stimulus, and data points that are shorter than that will be seen with skepticism and at least analyzed more closely. But here it happens all the time, right? If the mean response latency is 56 milliseconds, right, a lot of the data points would be suspicious. We've seen that talking in interactions is actually quite a complex endeavor, right? I need to listen to what you're saying, how you're saying, the way you're moving your head, the way you're gesturing, the way you're moving your body. I need to plan what I want to answer to you, anticipate when I can answer it. I should plan how to say it, and I should sort of anticipate how you're gonna react to my possible options in speech. That seems quite daunting. Yet, right, we've seen children doing it. How do they learn to take turns? Or what are the mechanisms that underlie their ability to take turns? This is where, I usually get these questions when I'm working with my kids or in the middle of the night, and then I get back to my office super excited and tell my students, guess what? I have a new things that I know nothing about. Can we learn about it? And so I involved two interns, Guyane and Versip, and a PhD student, Chris Cox, to do a systematic review and meta-analysis of turn-taking in child-caregiver interactions. And we did a keyword search and a bibliographic search. We got about 266 papers. We found 27 of them who had empirical estimates of actual response latencies. They're represented there. Each of the node is a paper. The more bibliography is shared between two papers, the stronger the connection. And I could talk about these kind of analysis forever, but that's not the topic of this talk. I'm just going to say that there's a very dispersed discourse with papers not really citing each other and not really citing the literature. And that if we plot them in terms of languages that are analyzed, the red dots on the map, we see that everything I'm going to say from now on you should take with skepticism because it's only about very weird languages. Right. So we read the 26 papers very carefully. We look at the review papers and the conceptual papers. And what do we learn? Right. What are the theories about what underlies turn-taking abilities? Since I am at the MPI in Nijmegen, it shouldn't take you by surprise that the most influential approach is the interactive engine hypothesis by Stephen Levinson that basically says that human beings are naturally endowed with socio-cognitive abilities which enable even young infants to respond promptly to their caregiver that is vocalizing with them from very early on. These sociocognitive abilities are often discussed in terms of representational abilities, the ability to infer and represent mental states or intent and to react upon them. It doesn't need to be fully representational, but that's the general representation of them. As though the child is immersed in a more and more complex linguistic environment and starts producing language, meaning that it needs to plan more and more complex linguistic expressions, the turn-taking is expected to slow down until it reaches a peak, which, depending on the paper, might be at 9, 12, or 15 months. And then the turn-taking is supposed to speed up again until it reaches, again, at different points in time, often around 20, 24 months, adult response latency speed. A complementary approach, represented, for instance, by the work of Jana Iverson, is that as the child learns to engage the world with their body, that is, their motor abilities increase, they will become better and better at engaging speech as well, at perceiving the affordances for jumping in and at acting quickly enough to do so. A third and orthogonal approach, instead of focusing on how quickly children respond to the turn-taking, focuses on the interpersonal adaptation. What does that mean? It means that if I'm driving the car and I'm paying attention to traffic and whenever I need to turn left and I'm talking to my children, I might slow down due to the cognitive and attentional load my speech. And the ability of my children to take turns will be measured not in them just being very quick and tightly responding to me, but in actually adjusting to my tempo. And the most famous of the proponents of these ideas is a paper by Wilson and Wilson that proposes coupled oscillators as the implementational mechanism that makes this possible. So with these theoretical baggage, now we can go and see which of these ideas can be tested and what is the evidence present in the empirical data that we could extract from the existing papers. As in every one of my meta-analyses, very little. So we look at development, and we can see on the x-axis the age of infants in months. On the y-axis, the response latency in milliseconds. Each of the dots is one of the estimates that we could extract. The bigger the dot, the more certain the estimate. That means either the bigger the sample size or the smaller the heterogeneity in the population sampled. For representative purposes, I put a quadratic curve there that could describe the slowdown the slowdown and the speed up. But I hope you agree that that's a terrible fit. The best fit in that data set is a linear fit. Children, infants, take around 1 second to respond, and that doesn't change reliably over time. I'll say later, but I'm just going to anticipate, this is a cross-sectional analysis, so we shouldn't take it too closely. But this is the evidence in the data that we have from the meta-analysis. it wasn't possible to test the role of more specific individual differences in motor abilities, linguistic abilities, sociocognitive skills in those estimates, but we could find one population that has atypicalities in all three of these domains, namely autism. And there we can see that there is a slight but reliable slower response latency in the autistic population compared to the neurotypical. 1.3 seconds versus 1 second, and 300 milliseconds can actually feel quite a lot in a conversation. In terms of the adaptation theory, what we find is a very, very strong correlation between how fast at responding on average the child is and how fast at responding on average the parent or caregiver is. Again, these are aggregated data because that's what can be extracted from the existing papers. As I said, every time I run a meta-analysis, I end up with very few answers and with lots of questions, which is actually the way I like it, right? It would be boring otherwise. So, are children really that slow? I don't know if you have children or if you ever interacted with children, but my kids don't take 1 second to respond me. And also, if we think of Stivers and Dingemann's findings, right, 1 second is incredibly slower than what we see in adults, 250 or 56 milliseconds. Right? So we went and looked again at the method section and at the supplementary materials. And what we realized that there were two big issues. One is that most studies implicitly conceptualize overlappings, that is, I start speaking before you're done, as failed turn taking, and therefore remove that data. I don't know about you, but I scream every time that people remove data. Second, this is the kind of data that you get when you measure response latencies, right? There is a very long tail on the right of long response latencies, many more than you would expect if you were modeling them with the traditional way of modeling data that everybody uses in the field, that is a Gaussian or normal distribution. So basically what we see is that people are removing everything that's below 0 on the left, that is between 1/4 and 1/3 of the data, and they are modeling everything else with a Gaussian that is driven. That means the mean will be highly determined by the tail. So it won't be a good representation of the data. But what about temporal development? As I anticipated, right, our findings rely on mostly cross-sectional data. That is, we know that children are very heterogeneous in how they develop, but we only have a certain group of children at 10 months and a different group of children at 14 months. And it's a very noisy measure of development. Also, we've seen all these theories about individual differences and mechanisms that might support turn-taking abilities that question the fact that development is best operationalized as age. Right? We might want to have a much more fine-grained grasp of individual differences in different aspects of development. Finally, last set of questions is we've seen that adaptation is a strong finding, but what is really going on? If we see that on average parents that are slower have children that are slower or vice versa, what can we really conclude of that? What is driving these adaptation? For the nerds, I have some directed acyclical graphs or causal diagram that represent different scenarios, but the basic idea is that we might have that the child age is determining at the same time what the child can do to respond and leads the expectation of the parents, which will sort of adjust to the child age. Or we could have that the age is driving the child responses and the parent is adapting to them. Or we can have that the expectation of the parents are driving the parent responses and the child is adjusting to them, or a combination of all the above. It's just not something that we can really discriminate from the data that we have accessible. This brings me to my first meta point. is if we take systematic reviews as maps of the current state of evidence, we would be left with very little. But I see systematic reviews as maps for research, as a way to critically self-reflect on a field in order to identify the most interesting questions and methods that we can apply at the next step. And this leads us to the Yukon study that we designed, or the analysis of which we designed based on what we had learned in the meta-analysis. Right? The corpus description is in a paper with Letitia Nagel and Deborah Fain, who were instrumental in collecting the data. It's called Hearing You, Hearing Me, or Hearing Me, Hearing You. But very briefly, it's a longitudinal data set that for the purpose of this study has 66 infant caregiver diets, 30 of which involve an autistic child, with ages ranging from 18 to 62 months. There are 6 visits per child at distances of 4 months in which they're interacting with their parent. We have turn-by-turn uncensored data because we took the pain of figuring that out. And the children have been extensively assessed for clinical, linguistic, and cognitive development. I should also mention that they've been matched in terms of language, meaning that the autistic children are slightly older, about 10 months older than the neurotypical children or typically developing children. The questions that we can tackle with the data is, what is the within-child developmental trajectory of infant response times? How do turn-taking characteristics depend not on the age, but on sociocognitive, linguistic, and motor development? And to what extent do turn-taking characteristics depend on interpersonal adjustment on top of what we can see before? The first 2 questions basically say if the meta-analysis allowed us to look at the interdependence between these variables, autism, development, and response latency, we want to move to a situation where we deconstruct development in terms of linguistic, sociocognitive, and motor development. The methods are directed acyclical graphs-driven, multi-level X-Gaussian models with left censoring, and we can talk about that if you want in the discussion or in private, but the basic idea is that we want to correctly represent the fact that there is a bulk of the data that is symmetrically distributed around 0 and a long tail of slow response times. So when we look at development over time, what do we see on these data? Well, this is what we see. The response latencies are very much faster than in the meta-analysis, between 200 and 400 milliseconds at first visit, and between 0 and 250 milliseconds after 6 visits. Also, surprisingly, we see that defining about autism is inverted. Autistic children are much faster than the typically developing children. Right? They start at 250 milliseconds and they go to 0 milliseconds. Right? If you've attended my previous setup, you should start wondering what might be happening, and you might have an answer, right? Overlappings. What happens if we replicate the analysis that was in the meta-analysis? What happens if we remove overlaps? Well, suddenly we're at response latencies that are much more similar to the meta-analysis, 1.5 to 1.6 seconds. We see that at least at first visit, the autistic children are slightly but reliably so slower, although they sort of reach the typical development group after the 6 visits. We'll get back to this. But what happens if, when we try to deconstruct development, when we start to look at how individual differences matter in terms of explaining variance in the response latency? Here you see the pattern for social development. On the x-axis, you see the age in months of the children. On the y-axis, you see the response latency in milliseconds. In colorful, you see simulated children where all the other properties of individual of development, that is linguistic and motor development, are kept at average. And we see in yellow how a child would perform with one standard deviation above average of socialization scores. In turquoise in the middle, how an average socialization score child would perform. In purple at the bottom, how a one standard deviation below average child would perform. And we can see that yellow is on top, meaning that surprisingly, children with higher socialization skills are slower than the other children. When we look at linguistic development, we see that the picture is inverted, at least for the autism group, where children who have higher linguistic skills are faster, or at the bottom. For the typical development, it doesn't seem to matter. When we look at motor skills, we see again this intuitive picture that children with higher motor skills are faster no matter their group. What is happening with socialization? Well, you should have my answer by now. Overlappings. If we remove the overlappings, the picture flips. So what we see is that children with higher socialization skills are not just faster or slower, but they're becoming more centered at a few hundred milliseconds after the other has ended. That means that both the long tail and the overlappings are reduced. And that's why they seem slower, because there's much less overlap. Good. Now we want to go into adaptation. So we add an additional layer to our model where we're not just looking at differences in individual development, but we are also looking at how much children are adapting to their own previous turn, how much they're oscillating around their own tempo, and how much they're adjusting beyond that onto the previous turns from the adult interlocutor, right? Because what we want to control for is that if I'm slowing down and you're slowing down, and then I keep on slowing down just because I'm doing my own thing, right? It would look as if I'm adjusting to you, but I'm just doing my own thing. So we want to control for that and separate these two sources of variance. In terms of methods, again, we have directed acyclical graph-driven structural difference equations, which in the literature are often, or something similar is often called dyadic coupling or actor-partner interdependence model. But really, what we're trying to separate is how matched we are at conversation level, how consistent you are with yourself, and how much you're adjusting to the other. This is actually something that I just took out of the RStudio last night, so I'm not fully interpreting this, but this is how well matched at the conversation level parents and children are. And actually what we see here is that in the autism group, we see the intuitive pattern. That is, children that are slower on average also have parents that are slower on average. But for the typically developing group, we see that after controlling for these patterns of self and interpersonal adjustment, we actually see the opposite. Faster parents have slower children. Slower parents have faster children. I have no idea what it means yet. It's literally off the analysis box from yesterday. But what I can use that for is to say that this is one level of description of the data which is independent from the others. We can show different patterns at the conversation level and at the turn-by-turn level. Indeed, let's look at how children are adjusting to themselves. You see in the top two plots, on the x-axis the previous child response in milliseconds, and on the y-axis the current child response latency, and we see a clear positive pattern. If I'm slower than average at time 1, I will also tend to be slower than average at time 2. For the adult caregivers, we see the same pattern, but much weaker. They're not as self-determined to a certain extent. There is no difference between groups, neither in the children nor in their caregivers. When we look at interpersonal adjustment, we see a similar pattern where both groups, both adult and children, are positively driven by the other person turn. That is, if you're slower than average at the previous turn, I will also tend to be slower than average at this turn. And we see here that the strength of the connection is inverted, with the children having a slightly less pronounced interpersonal adaptation and the adults having a stronger adaptation. Also, this sort of sent me on a rabbit hole, because in principle, if when you're slower, I'm slower, and when I'm slower, I'm slower, and when I'm slower, you're slower, are we sort of stagnating forever? Or getting, like, if we're going faster, to the limits of physiological speed? So we started introducing legs to see how tightly knit these feedback loops are. And here you see on the x-axis increasing legs in terms of conversational turns. On the y-axis, the effect size of intrapersonal or interpersonal adjustment. And you don't need to look at the detail of the data, but really what we see that across groups and across children and adults, these feedback loops last for about 3 to 5 legs, which for interpersonal adaptation means 5 to 9 conversational turns before they fade away. So there is an interesting time scale of analysis of these slowly moving waves of going slower and slower and slower and faster and faster and faster. As this is some new finding, we wanted to see whether they would generalize. Luckily, I was part of an incipient study that was run at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, funded by Roche, where we were assessing 28 autistic children, 12 of which were female, and 20 typically developing children, 12 of which were female, on 10 years on average. We were testing them for 7 sessions in consecutive weeks. We had actually planned on doing 1 on the phone and 1 in person, but COVID, they're all on the phone. And for the purpose of these study, they were doing a matching game, a referential game with a caregiver, and they were doing affiliative conversation, let's talk about your birthday, with, in turns, 1 week, a previously unknown research assistant and a familiar caregiver. The results that I'm presenting generalize across this context. The methods that we applied were the same as in the previous analysis. First, before we even started looking at generalization, I wonder how reliable are the measures that we're using of turn taking, which, since I'm starting to get into psychometrics, I was very excited to be able to measure. That is, if we see that child 1 is on average slower than child 2 and 3 in the first week, would this ranking be preserved across visits? How invariant are these measures of response latencies? How much they correspond to individual traits of the participants? And so we tested for retest reliability, and we find that the correlations between the individual estimates are roughly in line with what we would expect in a bunch of adolescents. So something about 0.4 to 0.5 correlations. And over time, there seems to be sort of a slight decrease when we have a distance of 6 visits, but there's only 1 data point at that level, so I don't know how much I would trust. At least on a visit-to-visit base, the measure seems to be reliable. So we can then go and trust the measure to a certain extent and say, do the findings from the previous study generalize to this slightly different population sample, slightly different context? We found before that autistic individuals are faster at responding, and this is replicated. We found that this was lastly due to overlapping. That is, removing overlapping, we would lose the effect, and that is also replicated, which is exciting, right? Rarely happens to me. We had that higher socialization would lead to slightly longer response latencies, higher linguistics slightly shorter, higher motor slightly negative, but especially in autism, not in typically developing children. And And here I need to do a bit of a detour, actually. We had measured social skills in the previous task with Vineland socialization scores. I had ensured we had the same measures in this study. I looked at the correlation, and there was no correlation between Vineland socialization scores and the response latencies. I started talking with the clinical people about this, and they told me, oh, but Vineland socialization score is a really good score to measure subtle variations in social function. You measured Vineland once over 7 weeks. We expect that score, if it were to measure every week, to vary quite a lot. So we went back to the drawing board. We looked at what other questionnaires had been collected, thanks to requests by other researchers, and we used the social responsiveness score, which is supposed to measure something that is more unchanging in the children. And here, indeed, we replicate the same pattern of results where the scores in social awareness and social motivation are related to higher response latencies due to this restriction in the breadth of response latencies, but scores of social cognition are actually following the more intuitive pattern of just faster responses. When we look at linguistic scores in these older population, we see that only for the autistic group we can see the same pattern, but not for the typically developing group. And when we look at motor skills, we find nothing. It might be because this is a different population. It might be because it was spurious. Future research will tell. When we look at self-adjustment and interpersonal adjustment, we find exactly the same patterns with a nice bonus that the adolescents, they tend to look a bit more like adults than the children were in the previous study. So their interpersonal adjustment becomes stronger than their self-adjustment. And also here I have a small thing. Psychometrics, it's tricky, right? We would have wanted to use the same measure, Vineland socialization scores, but the properties of the measures, which I had no idea of before I started the study, sort of were badly fitted for the task, and it was better for us to change things. Okay, this is another thing that is just out of the analysis box. When I present this kind of research to linguists, they tell me, oh, but response latency can be a million different things. What were people doing? Were their responses contingent to the previous conversational turn? Because that should matter. Okay, how do I do that on a 400 hours corpus? Well, what we did is I called my colleague who specialized in language models, and we operationalized content for the moment in terms of predictability from previous turn. That is, we use contextual embeddings, and we see at how distant the embeddings in the given turn are from this context that is set up by the previous turns. We operationalize that in the other turn, that is how hard it is for me to process your turn as I'm planning mine, but also own predictability. A very bad and noisy probably proxy for how hard it is for me to plan my turn as I'm planning it while listening to you, right? We see that other predictability is following what we would expect. The easier to predict the previous turn given the context, the faster your response. Latency, largely driven by interactions with unfamiliar interlocutors. That is, if we only analyze the interactions with familiar interlocutors, we would see a trend, but no statistically reliable pattern. But the unfamiliar interlocutors really have a strong pattern, and when we analyze all of them together, everything is reliable. When we look at self-predictability, how easy it is to plan your own turn, we see very uncertain effect. Maybe it makes autistic participants slightly faster if their content is predictable from the context. However, all these estimates are very uncertain, and the way I interpret it is that we are just throwing in the blender all sorts of conversational moves that might imply very different mechanisms and cognitive loads, and something that we will need to do very painfully is to have a more fine-grained annotation of the conversational moves if we want to make any proper sense out of this. Qualitative for the win, right? So, what have we learned? And I'm going to wrap up. So, it's the importance of overlapping and long tails, right? No matter what previous people have done, right? We should actually look at our data and see how they look like and model them accordingly. This also brings me at a slightly snarky comment on pre-registration. That is, we could have looked at what the literature was doing and the kind of effects that are reported in the literature, pre-registered the same procedure, found exactly the same result, and that, at least in certain circles, would have seemed to have a stronger evidentiary value than our analysis where we did the proper modeling, I would argue. And that's where I think that pre-registrations and meta-analysis are useful tools to think things through, but we shouldn't take them at face value. We shouldn't take them as cages. Indeed, it's not against pre-registration, because then we did a second study where we tried to use the same methods, right, to see whether they would generalize. But then again, also there, we had to change something once we understood the data better. So I think that this critical cumulative development is something we should focus on. The second is that we need fine-grained perspectives on developments, right? We want to have very specific individual differences in the developmental domains that we think are relevant, and not just age. I know age is convenient. If I want to work on childless, age is the only thing I have to go on. But we need to do better, right? And we need better data sets. Also, right, that we have learned that response latencies are not sort of just an individual trait, but it's something that is dynamically adjusted on a turn-by-turn base. And I think that a lot of other behaviors that are studied in conversation and speech actually need that sort of turn-by-turn add-on to understand them better. Also, I'm going to make here a slight note to myself, that is, we're showing all sort of interesting differences, but do they make a difference for language development? We haven't investigated that. Do they make a difference for the way we perceive the quality of the interaction? We have no idea, right? A slower response latency in a child might not mean the same that a slower response latency in 2 undergrads at Dartmouth in Emma Templeton's study. And also, but I'm going to skip on this very quickly, these were just fancy regressions, and they're not really good formalizations of the mechanism that might be generating these data. That's why the next step is a systematic review of the non-human animal literature. And I'm just going to skip that. Several models have been proposed for different species in a very unsystematic way. So what we're doing is we're actually reading closely these papers and implementing them in an R package so that they can be applied across these different animals and cross-pollinate our human-animal research. Because when we look at these animal research and think about our human-animal research, we can notice a few things that we could do better besides formalizing the mechanism. First is that overlappings are often seen as functional in a lot of these animals. And we haven't done a good job at describing what happens in overlappings. I have a rant on that if you want to hear that in the discussion. Second is that often these recordings of animals are put on collars that the hyenas wear while they're crawling around the savannah. And that creates some interesting challenges on how we understand turn-taking over the time scale of a day beyond the turn-by-turn dynamics. And as we get more day-long recordings, actually that's something that we should learn from. How do we think about these time scales? But also, as we look at animal studies from our human perspective, right, we suddenly start seeing blind spots and things that should be considered more. So conversational moves or speech acts and function of the vocalization should matter. Right? That's completely unconsidered in the non-human animal literature. But also cognitive load and predictability of what the communication is doing could have a role. And there is lots of human research, which I haven't had the time to cover, on how the reward system might be involved in generating response latencies, right? That smooth response latencies might be rewarded, intrinsically rewarding. So, very final words, right? I thought I would start investigating turn-taking as a quick detour for a side project with my students and interns. Then I could go back to content and language, and as usual in my life, these turned out to be turtles all the way down, and it's very complex and fascinating. Second, the explicit evidence synthesis and cumulative building of research is crucial. We always say that, we always assume that, but when we put it into practice in formalized ways, I think it becomes very powerful. And again, not taking it as a cage that should constrain the way we do research next, but as a way of figuring out what's the most fun and interesting question. Doing good research, including on mechanisms, is very hard. Right? We don't need to do it all at once. We can build it one piece at a time. And also, we don't need to do it on our own. So we relied a lot on previous work. We realized we don't really get to the bottom of the mechanistic point, but we can publish, or at least attempt to publish the paper, and hope that it will stimulate other people and our own in doing better next time. And that critical, cumulative, collective science is the way to go. And with that, I thank you, the participant, the researchers who worked and published in the field, which work we could still rely on, and all the different teams that have been involved in the research.
Thank you very much for this really exciting talk. And any questions for Ricardo? We start with the junior researchers. No junior. I guess I have to go with, again, the juniority scale, and I'll go for Ivan.
Young inside.
Thanks, Ricardo. Wonderful presentation and overview. I have a lot of questions. Let me start with one. So your sort of damped positive feedback loop, is there any effect on content on that? Or content in the sense of what is it about, but also content in the sense of, in terms of whether it is a back channel or request for clarification, or it's a full sentence elucidating what happened in the birthday. So is there any, are these overlaps that seem to drive most of the effects really a subset of the possible tools that people have in a dialogue? So they're basically short assertions or even a or
That's an excellent question, the full answer of which I would love to know. We don't yet. What I can say is that we removed one-word utterances from the analysis, and the pattern doesn't change. Of course, back channels can be more than one word. Repairs are also very important, but we haven't had the resources yet to go and annotate and figure out exactly which kind of conversational moves the different utterances are. So I don't know. But it would be very interesting to know.
Is the 5 to 9 terms that you say is sort of capturing this positive feedback loop, either in terms of acceleration or deceleration, is it also a function of the content, or is it a sort of stable feature of the interaction?
So we see that roughly across the whole corpus. Right? We don't see that changing drastically from place to place, but we haven't done like a specific, like we haven't annotated the corpus in a way that would allows for saying, okay, oh, here we have a sequence of like unclarity that needs to be repaired, and then it's repaired. How does the pattern look there? We don't know. Yeah, it's the challenge of the big data, where we get finally enough data to run complex models, and that, as usual, opens more questions than otherwise, and we need to rely on the goodwill of our qualitative colleagues to help us figuring out what's going on. So taking, for instance, I've been trying to persuade a collaborator group of mine at University of Connecticut who does qualitative research to take the overlappings and sort of identify which kind of function they perform in the conversation. I haven't managed yet to persuade them. They're already doing some qualitative coding of another project of mine, so that's, I think, too much to ask.
Thanks.
Hi, yeah, just to follow up on Ivan's question, so have you looked at least at maybe a subset comparing the autistic kids with the typical kids to see why there is so much more overlapping or overlaps in the autistic group? So is it that are they better predictors? Are they more repetitive in what they say? Is there a larger disconnect between parent and child, what they say? Do you have any insight?
So at this stage, we only mapped out some hypotheses that we have. So we have that, for instance, you might have that a lot of the content, especially in child-caregiver interactions, is very redundant. We might have, very speculatively, we don't know, like autistic children might be jumping in earlier, right? The fact that it's redundant is enough to just jump in. We might have that there is less connection on a semantic level. We know, though, that on average, the semantic alignment between children and parent is only slightly lower in the autistic population. And in general, it's actually lower both in autistic and typically developing pairs than it is in surrogate pairs. That isn't just matching. So randomly, there would be more redundancy if we matched a parent from pair 1 and a child from pair 2 than there is in these actual pairs.
Mm-hmm. And do you see it as a kind of, a feature that is indicative of the conversation between autistic kids and their parents being less functioning, the fact that there is more overlap? Or
no,
not?
I think that overlaps can be very functional.
Okay. Yeah.
And so we would need the qualitative analysis to figure out what's going on there.
And I'm asking particularly because in our corpora we see huge amounts of overlap between typical adults, so much more than those figures. So I was intrigued.
So I don't know, again, anecdotal, right? Overlappings in conversations with my children are very functional, right? Are part of the shared tempo.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thanks. My question is, could we dissociate the interactional engine aspect, which I think is a driving force for the turn-taking and so on and so forth, from the more mechanistic processing that might be at stake? So you seem to be surprised that this turn-taking is fast. But in a way, I'm never so surprised about that, because we know that predictive processing is a hallmark of every aspect of language and every aspect of processing. So therefore, that seems to be just one instantiation of the capacity for predictive processing, and just one of them. And actually, the interesting thing here is your autistic data, because there one would assume that at least some aspect of the interactional engine, in the sense of attributing certain mental states to the other person, is not optimally functioning. And that means the amount of computation that need to be done in order to figure out what the other person is intending is less the case, and therefore the low-level cues that allow you to predict when your turn is over and when this turn is over and you can jump on might be faster even, and that's what you find. So can we dissociate the interactional engine from the predictive coding aspect that is a mechanistic account of the speed, but not necessarily specific to turn taking?
Yes, this is a very interesting question. I'll first caution that my surprise was purely dramatic, for dramatic purposes. because it builds up the argument better. Yeah, but so one of the reasons we started working on predictability was exactly to start disentangling these sort of aspects, right? So if a turn is easier to predict, right, we might expect, for instance, jumping in much earlier. And then we might have, very speculatively, that what the autistic children are doing is actually jumping in when they don't need to predict anymore, while the children with higher socialization skills are learning to wait until the right time, right? And I think that that's one direction where I want to go. So doing these predictability analysis while being aware of the conversational moves, and at the same time having qualitative coding of what is going on in the overlapping. Is that something that is just a non-contingent response from the child, or is it a contingent response that is just skipping the predictable part? I'm also very intrigued by something might be going differently in the interaction with the autistic children, because I would expect parents to interact differently with their autistic children than they would with a typically developing child. So their speech might provide different affordances for jumping in, different affordances for predicting than the speech of parents of typically developing children. And that's also something that we need to look more at, because that's, in these naturalistic data, that's something that we cannot really control, but at least we can model, so that we can compare in a more realistic way these data with data from experiments where there is a fixed like conversational snippet or turn that is presented to the participants, and they have to push a button when they think they should jump in. And there again, we see that children with autism are slower. Right? So there's something that the parents might be doing in interaction with the children to sort of provide affordances for faster turn taking. Right? And that might be what also we see. So I agree. We're not saying that the interaction engine is wrong, right? It's actually a really good lead for starting the analysis. And we need to add the predictability analysis with the conversational moves to figure out what's going on.
Thanks. I was just wondering, if we're talking about overlap, we are basically calculating from when the parent stops talking and how much earlier the child has started to talk. But with the turn taking, you normally measure the time when someone voluntarily stops talking until the other person starts to react. But with the overlaps, we don't know how long the parent planned to still continue talking. And it could also just be a fundamental interruption and not just predicting the end. Yeah. So we have like basically two different types of overlaps, and we cannot predict whether this is an interruption by the child of a conversation or a turn that was still supposed to be another 10 seconds, or if they just predicted the end early. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, we have the sureness for that for the later coming turns, but not for the overlapping ones. And that could also have an effect on whether the parent just stops talking because they were interrupted. Yes.
And I think I fully agree, 400 hours of corpus. So yes, we will, I'm collaborating with language technology people to see if we can do partially qualitative coding, which is scaled up using automated annotation, which is then checked with manual coding. It is a long process, and we would like to have more resources to get the manual coding in place, which is non-trivial, right? It requires building good coding schemes, checking intercoder reliability, because we don't just want to do these bad automated annotation based on ChatGPT, right, or something like that. But you're right, yes. I think that all of these questions are really highlighting these productive interplay between these large-scale analysis, which raise questions, which then need qualitative analysis, that then we might try either to quantify if we have enough manual annotation or scale up in the hopeful future that the IA people are promising us, And then that will probably raise even more questions that can only be solved by qualitative coding, right? And I think this is the best of the possible worlds, where we just help each other understanding better these data. Yes, thanks.
Hey, thanks for this wonderful talk. I had a question about your predictability measure. So you mentioned briefly that this was based on contextual embedding. So is this something like a semantic vector, word-to-vec-like measure, or could you explain a little bit more about that?
So it's, I can't remember which version of BERT it is.
Yeah.
So it's not word-to-vec, where each word has a dictionary set of embeddings independently of context. Is a model that takes the preceding context and define the embeddings according to the preceding context.
So here's the point. Continuers, like
yes,
are using that measure maximally unpredictable.
Yes.
Because they can virtually follow any kind of turn, therefore any kind of last word, and be followed by any kind of first word, which is also quite a large variety. But so that means your measure of predictability doesn't really capture, at least a self-predictability measure, doesn't really capture how hard it is for me to plan this thing, because planning a continuer is not hard. I can just go, whatever you did, whatever you will do next. And so I don't think that captures really what you were after.
Yes, I would agree. And that's where we need these conversational moves kind of analysis. Yes. One of the fun things that happens, I'm part of a project that is trying to track classroom speech in a special needs school. And we're testing Whisper to see how that affects our measures against manual transcription and annotation. And what we see is that lexical alignment is overinflated in the Whisper transcriptions, because Whisper is smart, right? It's using what happens before to transcribe what happens next. So if there is anything which is in doubt, it's just going to reuse lexemes from the previous sentence. And yeah, so it's just interesting because it's the opposite case, right? So it's not about whatever they're saying. It's much likelier that it's going to be something that has come before, right?
Yeah. A possible measure, by the way, just that you might try to use is simply within corpus predictability of turns. Like if you just rank all of the turns and take the most frequent ones for even within a diet for a person or across all diets, then the continuers will come out on top. And therefore, by that measure, they are predictable.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that's and we could include that measure. That would be very neat. Thanks.
Hi. Your question made me laugh because is not what 3-year-olds mostly say. They mostly say why. That's the most unpredictable. Everything, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Why, blah, 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 why. But actually, I have a question about what happens before 2, because actually in language development 2 is quite late. You're already pretty good interlocutor. You're already mostly even, speaking more than one word utterance. And of course, one of the things about the interactive engine was thinking about why do children do turn taking, which we know happens really, really early on, if not from birth, after a few days. Non-verbal turn taking really happens very early. And so I was interested in what you didn't talk about by your cross sort of fertilization, looking at turn taking in humans and animals and the mechanisms of turn taking that might reveal. So could you say a little bit more about that? Do you know, is there more to say about what the mechanisms of turn taking might be in humans and other animals, and therefore might be behind pre-verbal turn taking?
Yes, so this is pretty much in progress, but so in the animal literature, the dominant model is different variations of periodic oscillators. And that might be something that could be implemented at a very early stage. I don't believe that periodic oscillators per se are the actual answer to the problem. They're a preliminary step. And the main reason for which I'm skeptical of them solving the problem is that if they were the model, we should expect multimodal distributions of response latencies, as the period of the oscillator would indicate a maximum likelihood at 1n or 2n or 3n or 4n of the period. And we don't see that in the real data. But I think that just the effort of building the model and see where it fails, even in early infants, will teach us something valuable. And then we can, on top of that, put predictive models that are, I think they could be integrated with when in the period we should enter the next turn of conversation. And again, it might fail, but failures are very informative often. Right? They open up new questions. Yes.